Welcome to the New Thinking for a New World podcast, where we explore the most pressing issues that are challenging and changing our societies. We are looking for new thinking and new solutions wherever we can find them. Listen as host Alan Stoga, the Talberg Foundation's chairman, challenges his guests for analysis, ideas and actions. Together, we can help make our world at least a bit better.
The Middle East is going through a profound political, economic, social transformation. In the past couple of years, peace treaties have been signed between Arab countries and Israel. New investment and trade relationships are emerging based on economics, not ideology or religion. The threat of war between Shia and Sunni seems to be fading, and Western powers, especially the United States, are becoming much less dominant, maybe much less relevant than they've been for at least 100 years. Almost more amazing than any of that, in December, more than 700,000 Saudi kids participated in a 4-day rave in the Saudi desert with regular intermissions for Islamic prayers. What's going on? Has the Middle East of strict Islam suddenly turned into something more modern? Have they figured out how to move beyond religious conflict? In a world that wants to abandon hydrocarbons, are the Arabs just enjoying the last party before their world collapses? What happens when foreign powers become spectators rather than actors? Is it imaginable that, with the imperial powers more or less gone, the locals can actually find the peace and prosperity that has eluded them for so long? My guest today has some answers, or at least the knowledge, experience, and insight to ask better questions than I do. Neil Quilliam is deeply engaged with the Middle East and North Africa from his current perch at Chatham House in London, his service in the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and his long history of living in and working on the Gulf and the Levant. Welcome, Neil.
Thanks, Alan. Very good to be here this afternoon.
It's hard to know where to start with the Abraham Accords or the rave. In overlapping ways, they both seem revolutionary. Am I overstating how fundamentally and how fast things seem to be changing in the Middle East, in the Gulf in particular?
No, I don't think you are. I mean, if we focus on the rave, actually, to begin with, I mean, what a transformation that Saudi Arabia is undergoing. I mean, you've gone from a situation, where you had the religious police on the streets, tapping people's legs or whacking them with sticks for, dressing inappropriately or behaving immodestly, however one defines that, to, having, as you said, a very large bunch of young men and women mixing, dancing, partaking of all sorts of things, in modern Saudi Arabia. I mean, that is big, that is profound, and that's a huge transformation. I mean, to a certain extent, those changes have been there for some time, but they've sort of been happening, under the surface. But now this is, right front and center. It's releasing the energies of Saudi youth, and that just seems to be just almost like a little tsunami that's just sweeping through the kingdom. MBS has really kind of hit the release button on that. So I see that as deep and profound. When one sort of drills down a little bit, that's not the whole population in Saudi itself, of course. It does sit most comfortably with the elite, with the privileged, with those sort of sitting in the major urban centers. It probably looks really quite different outside in the sort of the nether regions, if it were, of the kingdom. But absolutely, this is a big and in many ways exciting change.
You said a couple things there that I want to tug on. One is, I don't think I ever expected to hear the words modern Saudi Arabia connected to each other. That there is a modern Saudi Arabia is astounding. But you also referenced MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince. How much of what's going on, how much of this release you're talking about is the Crown Prince having a vision and executing it? How much of it, is it about leadership? Is he leading the parade, or is the parade chasing him?
I think it's essentially a combination of the two things. I mean, the way I sort of characterize it is, he came very, very quickly, to the forefront. His father sort of brought him in. We'd all been waiting for the next generation prince to take over, from Abdullah or from Salman, and many of us had fixated on Mohammed bin Nayef, thinking that he was going to be the next one. But actually, it basically jumped another half generation and came down to MBS. And I think, quite frankly, MBS, looked around him, looked at the situation, and realized with the country's, burgeoning demographic, and with the hydrocarbons, historical arc where it is, realized that, in fact, if this ruling family is going to hold on to power, if it's going to govern the kingdom for the next 50, 60 years, some deep change has to take place. And I also think, he was there, in his late 20s, playing on his, whatever it would have been, his Xbox or whatever, he was sat there having a lot of fun. Very much kind of, a contemporary of his age, of course. He wasn't one of these older guys sort of sat in their 80s, sort of pondering on where they come from. His I guess his vision was very much on the future. He was in touch with that kind of sentiment. And something, I suppose, that is associated with youth, not necessarily, but there's an energy, a dynamism, there's a brashness and an impatience. And I think he obviously felt those things, but the population did too. For a very long time, we had heard about the reforms that Abdullah had been bringing in, and these were piecemeal reforms and piecemeal change. They would fly the flag to see, can women drive? Can they not drive? We've been hearing that story for at least 30 years. There he is, he comes in and almost overnight, introduces these changes, obviously with the blessing of his father. And I think in doing so, he sort of opened the floodgates, if you like, for a lot of sort of pent-up excitement and enthusiasm from a Saudi youth which didn't recognize, the Saudi of their fathers or their grandfathers. They recognized a country that they wanted it to look like, elsewhere, like the West, where that energy is released. So I think he sort of opened the floodgates, and you can see that's just swept through. And it's hard not to be caught up by that enthusiasm when one goes to the kingdom. And I travel, COVID permitting. I travel a lot, and the changes I've seen. I've been going for 20 years now, but the changes I've seen in the last 4 or 5 years are really breathtaking. I mean, there are issues, there are massive problems, of course. That's not to say those things don't exist, but from a social perspective, from living in the kingdom, I was on a postdoc fellowship 20 years ago, where my interaction with women was extremely rare during my year there, to now going and sort of, going to restaurants where there's music, where women and men are sitting on the same table. I mean, it sounds strange, but for me, it was almost like a culture shock. Just thinking, what am I doing sat in this restaurant where there's music? I'm sat with these young Saudi women that I've met in London, and it's almost completely normal.
One of the things you said, which is terribly important, is that when we in the West think about modern and think about reform, we hear democracy and voting and political change. And just to underline the point you made, that's not part of this story. This story is about a crown prince, a visionary crown prince, perhaps, who clearly wants to remain in power, wants the family that he comes from to be the king, to be the source of political power and legitimacy for the future. So there is this separation between behaviors and governance, and that's likely to continue, I assume.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there is no talk whatsoever of political reform. That's not on the agenda at all. This is about social reform enabling economic transformation. I mean, that's the vision. It's looking post hydrocarbons. How does this country, which is effectively the size of Western Europe, that's sort of 90%, if not more, really dependent on hydrocarbons. How does it manage that significant transition when its economic base really has to shift and change? It's definitely not about political reform. There is nothing on the agenda. There is no discussion. about emboldening or giving greater powers to the Shura Council, which is appointed. There is no looking at Kuwait and thinking, do we want a parliamentary system that's going to emulate that, or are we going to have a system similar to the one that the Qataris are putting in place? No. This is in fact what you had since 2015. You've gone from a system where you had a very large number of princes that were involved in decision making, where consensus was essentially the driver of decision making, and that's why things used to take an absolute age to get done. Where you've got a concentration, a consolidation of power in the hands, effectively of one person, and that's the crown prince. And when he becomes king, it will sit entirely in his hands. Who wants to force through and push through change, the manner in which he wants to do it, and those he mobilizes behind him will be there to make it happen. But opening that space, definitely not. And when I look at Saudi Arabia now, say to 10 years ago or even 20 years ago, it was much easier to have conversations, around politics, around reform. 20 years ago, you could have those quite comfortably. 10 years ago, that started to close a little bit. But that space for discussion now has really, really narrowed. So you've got a real inconsistency in terms of where the political reform process is, or where it's absolutely stopped, but the social economic space is opening up.
To some extent, that parallels what's going on in other countries. It's true in the Emirates. It's true in other Gulf sheikdoms. They are sheikdoms first and going through this social transformation, perhaps economic transformation. Is all of that sustainable? Is there ultimately a conflict, or is there a risk of conflict? I'm thinking of the Chinese comparison, the Russian comparison, other places that loosened up economically and socially, didn't change politically, and sooner or later there's a car crash. Are the cultures so different here that that's unlikely to happen anytime soon?
It's hard to imagine it happening anytime soon. I mean, if one were to sort of project out, maybe 10, 15 years time, you could. It really depends where the economy sits, whether the expectations now, which are really through the roof, have been met. I mean, they're not going to be met, but have they been met 50%? Then maybe they can sort of muddle through. But if you've got a sort of a discontent population that feels marginalized from the economic progress that's being felt by the elite, by the privileged in society, you could have the grounds for discontent. There could be expressions of that, but it's hard to imagine it at the moment. That some way in the distance, if things don't go the way they're supposed to. I mean, obviously, Vision 2030 is there, the aspirations there, the goals are there, the KPIs are there. They'll be very lucky to get to 40% of that, but that in itself might be enough. But where you've got a system where you're reforming subsidies, where you're cutting a lot of the benefits that have been enjoyed by parents and grandparents, you start to sort of eat away a little bit at the bedrock of support if benefits don't percolate through other ways.
So let's add some other ingredients to this souffle and start with the Israelis. Can the Israelis and the Gulf Arabs collaborate? They have a lot of the same issues to deal with, obviously. Is that part of this new Middle East, and is it sustainable?
So the states are sort of trying to move into that space and kind of hold the ring, and I think, the relations between most of the Gulf states and Israel, as we know, have existed informally for quite some time, and have operated on a number of levels. But I think what's happened is, given that this kind of burden sharing is very much there, given that Iran is seen essentially as a malign force in the region by the Gulf Arab states, there's a natural tie-up of interests between Israel and the Emirates specifically, and one can also sort of see that playing out certainly with the Saudis. At what point that becomes public, at what point that becomes formalized is another matter. But I see that relationship, particularly between the Emiratis and the Israelis, as being very strong, as being quite robust.
If you feel that the world lacks global leaders, please help support the Talberg Foundation programs. Individual donations are being accepted at talbergfoundation.org/donate. That's TALLBERG foundation.org/donate.
Dr. Doolittle had push me, pull you. And as I think about the Israelis and the Arabs, it seems to me a combination of both. They have a lot in common, fear of Iran. They have a lot in common, potential economic transformations. That's been most pronounced, as you just said, with the Emiratis, but it's quite clear that others want in that game. I won't ask you how much is one, how much is the other, but is it about opportunity or is it about fear? Now we've got sort of the Sunni Israelis on one side, and you've got the Persians on the other side, with who knows, everybody on the side, the Americans, the Europeans, the Chinese, the Russians, sort of circling all that. How does that work out? Is there a solution that they can reach among themselves? Somehow the Persians, the Iranians, and the Arabs and the Israelis figure out, it's the co-prosperity sphere stuff modernized. Is that possible?
I think it's difficult to imagine it coming together quite as comfortably as you've described. I think that is a likely trajectory towards where it's heading, but that might be a good decade of, again, 15 years till it gets there. I think what we're seeing now, we seem to be in this process where alliances is again, it's too strong a word as you've suggested, but there are sort of emerging alliances, and then they break, and then there are new alliances. So if one winds back, a few years ago, you had one alliance, one counter, if you like. You had the Saudis, you had the Emiratis. Arguably, you had the Israelis sort of tucked into that. You had the Egyptians, and there was this thought about, Haftar being part of that in Libya. And we would probably characterize that as very strange word to use in this sense, but secular states, or states that push back against Islam. So, it's almost an anti-political Islamic alliance of states. They believe in sort of secular rule in terms of policy, obviously not in terms of faith structures. They believe on having a strong and able and capable military, and limiting space for political participation. Obviously, that doesn't apply to Israel, but that's how it was seen in that space. And on the other side, you had loosely aligned, you could say, Turkey, Qatar, and Iran. But of course, we've seen a de-escalation over the past 9 months in the region. We've seen the Emiratis now sort of not cozying up, but certainly from a tactical perspective, speaking more and more to the Iranians. Obviously, they've got the Abraham Accords, but they've started to engage with the Turks as well, and they're looking to explore that. So you've got this flux in an order. And it's not clear quite how that's going to mesh together, whether that's going to come together in something comparable where there is a system of managing the security where each player can somehow sort of plug and play into that. That's somewhere off, but I see the Emiratis as being instrumental in sort of working amongst and between all of these different states at any one given time. The likelihood that they'll get burnt is quite significant, or quite high. But to go back to your earlier question, they can play with Iran. They can see how far they can get. They can manage that relationship because there's a concern about the threat that Iran poses. But I see that their key relationship really going forward as Israel. That relationship with Israel will allow them to hedge against Saudi, the regional hegemon. They're trying to play through Israel to work that relationship now.
The Emiratis.
So yes, with Turkey. So I see the Emiratis as sort of being central to all of these sort of little small forming groupings, well, it's best to call them. But I think that space is going to be in flux for some time to come. So it's hard to identify one potential alliance, because in 6 months' time that will break up. That the contours of that will shift.
Well, let me ask about the dark underbelly. We haven't had a big war in the region for some time. Yemen, intifadas, etc., but big wars involving multi-states for some time. And it wasn't that long ago that there was a profound worry that another one was inevitable, this one between Iran and its friends and the Gulf Arabs. It was indeed part of the motivation for the American deployments during at least part of this period. Is that impossible now? Is one question, and the flip side of that question, which we've not mentioned the N word, which in this case is nuclear. If the Iranians go from near breakout to actually weapons, does that change everything?
So, I mean, nothing is inevitable, of course, but I find it very hard to imagine that you have an interstate conflict. You can have a hot conflict, but Iran, say, invading, or a Gulf Arab state carrying out like a sovereign invasion into Iran. I can't. That for me, that's almost impossible to imagine.
So there is no Saddam Hussein floating around in this ether.
No, absolutely not. I mean, the Iranians are not about to do that, and I can't see any of the regional states wanting to get involved in that. I mean, we say this a lot. MBS thought he was going to go into Yemen. It was going to be done in 2 weeks. I mean, painful lessons have been learned. It doesn't mean, obviously, that conflict by other means, by proxy, which is the way in which business is done in the region, isn't going to continue or isn't going to intensify. I mean, we can see that we're in a point at the moment of de-escalation. That can easily, that the heat can certainly sort of be turned up again, depending on where JCPOA is, or on nuclear weaponization, as you've sort of referred to. But I think we're in this phase at the moment where all sides are sort of reevaluating, where their real interests are. Just to flip back to Saudi just for a second. I mean, MBS, doesn't want to go to war with Iran. I mean, that poses a massive threat to the country. He wants to get the economy up and running. He wants to bring about that transition and that transformation. I think he's probably learned some painful lessons since coming to prominence. That's his key focus. So he's likely to do all that he can to prevent conflict. And the Iranians, they have their legacy of wars anyway, and they've suffered tremendous losses as a consequence of that. Hence, they pursue war by other means. The question on JCPOA, it's more about the weaponization, and weaponization is probably a year away, even if they were to break out in the next month. So there is that period, I guess, in which JCPOA can address that. But certainly, if the Iranians chose to weaponize, then that, even if they get to breakout, I think that will spur a nuclear arms race in the region. I don't think the Emiratis and I don't think the Saudis would be comfortable sort of sitting back and thinking, okay, we're going to live under the umbrella that the US has provided us for a long time, because their confidence or the faith in that is no longer.
Or under the Israeli umbrella.
Right.
As this region changes, is it the American umbrella that they might be looking to invoke, or the Israeli umbrella? We all know the Israelis have nuclear weapons. We don't say it out loud very often, but part of this new alignment does indeed perhaps have that aspect.
I mean, I certainly think that's there, and I would strongly suspect that the Emiratis and certainly the Saudis, if they were to go down this route, would be looking for that umbrella. But it will be tried and untested whether the Israelis would be willing to sort of raise the umbrella in support of those states is another matter. There's still a lot to work out on what those relationships actually mean in practice and in fullness, and to understand, are they real alliances, or are they, transactional relationships that, that serve one another's purposes. But, where are the red lines? Those things don't, obviously they haven't been mapped out, and they haven't been tested either. But most definitely, I mean, there is a look to Israel and Israel's capability to lend support to, certainly to the Emirates, but I'm sure the Saudis will be looking for that too, in a sort of, in a post-US environment.
Well, maybe that's where we should go at the end of this conversation, which is the post-US environment. So you're in this space where the Americans are still more leaving than coming, and the Chinese aren't quite coming yet. Although I've seen recently, truth, who knows, the Saudis are manufacturing ballistic missiles with the help of the Chinese. The American intelligence claims that the Chinese are building a military facility in the UAE. We recently saw all the Gulf foreign ministers scamper up to Beijing in ways that wouldn't have happened a year or two or three, or certainly 5 years ago. So from a geopolitical point of view, clearly there's a lot in play. Not to say the role of Britain, not to say the role of the Europeans, nor the Turks, the Moroccans, who else might play in this space. But focus on China. What does China want in the Gulf? And what do the Gulf states want from China? Is this part of the hedging strategy?
Certainly from the Gulf states, it's part of the hedging strategy. They need to diversify their relationships, particularly after the attacks on Abqaiq in September 2019. I think the Saudis and Emiratis were shocked by what they would have seen as US inaction in response to those strikes. And I think this
was the attack on the oil facilities.
Exactly, that's right, on Abqaiq and Khurais, which took out a lot of refining and production for a short period of time. But I mean, they were precision strikes. I think the Iranians were able to demonstrate a capability that the Saudis had probably not anticipated.
So you must be a diplomat. You said that very, very precisely.
I probably said it quite a few times. So that's where that comes from. But that was a deep and profound shock, and I think that that literally sent a shockwave across the Gulf. And I think there's this sense, okay, our key partner is the US, and there's no doubt about that still. And I sat with some very senior Saudi officials a few months ago, and I was asking about China, and they were saying, make no bones about it, the US is our number one partner, and and I believe that, but that doesn't mean we're looking out to the future, and we understand that US interests are elsewhere. So therefore, we need to hedge, we need to diversify. And diversification, whether that's economic, whether that's through security, is just a fact of life, and that's that's something we have to do. And I think that's that's what you're seeing essentially at the moment. I recall when I was sort of with the Foreign Office, one of my colleagues, now a former ambassador, recounting how he had accompanied a number of Gulf leaders to China, to Beijing, to discuss sort of opening up the relationship. And so this is a decade ago. And the leaders came back. They were bitterly disappointed because the Chinese wanted the oil, or the Chinese wanted the energy resources, but nothing else. They wanted nothing strategic whatsoever. And they just simply looked at the region. This is the former ambassador's terminology, as a gas station. For them, it was transactional. It was a gas station. Yes, we need that for our own growth and development. But I think in that 10-year period, that has started to change. China is looking at the region more strategically. I don't think it does have its strategic relationships, of course, and it is committing resources through the BRI. And I think we will start to see it move into that space. But I mean, of course, we all know, I mean, it wants to bandwagon on the US security. It does not want to provide that security. It does not want to move into that space. And again, sort of pre-COVID, I made a number of sort of visits to Shanghai and to Beijing, at the behest of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, as with my Chatham House hat on, to discuss Syria and a few other issues. And they were looking at the time and trying to better explore and understand whether they should engage in sort of Syrian reconstruction, or they should engage more politically on Israel-Palestine. And I think my takeaway from that was, the costs for them would be too high. They just simply don't want to get involved on that level. They would like to take the spoils, but they don't want to expend that diplomatic, political, or certainly military capital, and they want to be friends with absolutely everybody. Hence, the Iranian foreign ministers in Beijing today, they want to be friends with both sides of the Gulf. And I think for the time being, that's the position they want, and they want the US to remain there as best as they can, providing that umbrella. Maybe that's going to change in 20 years' time. I keep thinking China's going to be there in the next 40 or 50 years. It's going to be ruining the day that it has really moved in and occupied that space. But for the time being, I think it's just looking and, navel gazing and thinking, okay, can we manage to help manage this region as the US moves out without committing, military resources?
Well, thank you for that. I've been trying to think what I'm going to call this episode, and I was committed to Game of Thrones, but maybe it should be As the World Turns, which is an old American soap opera, but maybe applies in this case. So, Neil, thank you very much for all of that. I appreciate your insights. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Buenissimo.
Thank you for joining us. Please rate our show on Apple Podcast and subscribe. Meanwhile, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or you can subscribe to our newsletter at tallbergfoundation.org to learn more about our work. That's TALLBERG foundation.org. Thank you, and we'll be back again next week for another episode of Tallberg's New Thinking for a New World. This podcast was brought to you through the generous support of SNF, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation.